We're going to move on to the trait theories. There's two, biosocial and psychological views. We're going to start with talking about the development of the trait theory. It's believed to originate with Dr. Cesar Lombroso in the late 1800s when he began focusing on biological traits from the time of birth. He was known as the father of modern criminology based on his theory of the born criminal, which dominated the thinking about criminal behavior in the late 19th and early 20th century. And essentially, he believed that criminality was inherited and that criminals could be identified by physical defects that confirmed them as being atavistic or savage, hence his theory of criminal atavism. And those physical defects were looking at things like a person's nose, or teeth, or jawline, and even if whether or not they had bloodshot eyes, and he can determine whether or not that person would engage in criminal behavior. Criminologist Enrico Ferri interweaved some social factors into Lombroso's theory at that time, and then criminologist Charles Goring challenged its validity altogether and claimed that delinquent behavior was the result of defective intelligence, which he claimed should be controlled by regulating reproduction of families that showed abnormal traits like feeble-mindedness. These early views portrayed delinquent behavior as a function of a single factor or trait, such as somebody's body makeup, their body build, and their level of intelligence, whether they have problems with intelligence. And these views quickly fell out of favor. And in the 20th century, the focus of delinquent behavior was on social factors, such as poverty and family life, implying that there was a biological or a psychological basis for delinquency. But then this theory was challenged as being racist or gender biased. Rather, criminologists adopted a sociological approach, advocating that environmental and social factors controlled behavior. And we'll cover that a little later in the semester. In 1975, criminologists renewed the interest in social biology, suggesting that behavior will adapt to the environment in which it evolved. Or in other words, the views that human behavior is motivated by inborn biological urges to survive and preserve the species, and thus in creating interest in finding a biological or psychological basis for crime and delinquency. So it prompted some to conclude that personal traits must be what separates the delinquents who commit crimes from those that don't. Possessing these traits may help explain why, when faced with the same life situation, one person commits a crime and another doesn't. Living in a disadvantaged neighborhood will not cause a well-adjusted delinquent to commit crime, and living in an affluent area will not stop a maladapted delinquent from offending. So all people may be aware of and even fear the sanctioning power of the law, but their behavior is controlled by traits present at birth or developed soon after. And today, our trait theory is divided into two branches. Delinquency can be found in a child's physical or biological makeup, and psychological traits and characteristics. So we're going to explore both of those sides of the coin, and we're going to start with biosocial theories. So let's start with biosocial theories of delinquency. This focuses on the association between biological makeup, environmental conditions, and antisocial behavior. The thought is kids who exhibit abnormal biological traits have difficulty adjusting socially, as a result making social relations challenging and thus vulnerable to crime-producing stimulus in the environment. There are three sub-areas of the biosocial theory used to explain this suggestion. We're going to talk about biochemical factors, neurological functions, and genetic history. Let's take the first sub-area, biochemical factors. Suspected relationship between antisocial behavior and biochemical makeup, that is the concern. And there are a number of factors. Can happen at conception. Mother who uses drugs or alcohol during pregnancy can cause prenatal damage and later antisocial behavior in adolescence. There's other birth complications that could occur. A head injury. Child can suffer a head injury. Environmental contaminants affect biochemical makeup, especially at high levels. Air pollution is said to affect cognitive functioning. Hydrocarbon, chlorine, and nitrogen dioxide have been said to cause severe defects or illness, and in some instances death. Lead exposure is linked to emotional and behavioral disorders. Lead ingestion has been said to be a direct cause of antisocial behavior. Diet and delinquency is a big one. A child's diet may influence his or her behavior through its impact on the body chemistry. So, maintaining a healthy diet can provide levels of minerals and chemicals needed for normal brain functioning and growth, especially in children. An improper diet can cause chemical and mineral imbalance and can lead to cognitive and learning deficits and problems. And these factors, in turn, have been associated with antisocial behavior. The research shows an oversupply or an undersupply of certain chemicals and minerals, things like caffeine, sodium, mercury, potassium, calcium, iron. They can lead to depression, hyperactivity, cognitive problems, memory loss, ADHD. Eliminating harmful substances and introducing beneficial ones into a child's diet can reduce the threat of antisocial behavior. People whose diet lacks sufficient polyunsaturated fats, minerals, and vitamins, and or contain too much saturated fat or sugar and a range of food and agricultural chemicals are at a high risk of developing psychological disturbances such as schizophrenia. I want to note a case. This is kind of a sidestep. I couldn't find a juvenile delinquent case on point that puts this together, but there was a case relevant to this topic. Daniel James White, who was an American politician. He assassinated the San Francisco mayor, George Moscone, and the supervisor, Harvey Milk, in 1978 at City Hall. The defense that he raised for killing them was that his behavior was precipitated by an addiction to sugar-laden foods. And it was a very controversial verdict that led to the coining, in legal terms, the Twinkie defense. While he was charged with murder one, he was convicted of manslaughter, which means the jury believed that defense, that the sugar-laden foods made him do it. Diet, sugar intake, it has an effect on behavior. And in that case, the defendant couldn't just get up on the stand and say, hey, the sugar made me do it. He needed an expert criminologist to enter the courtroom with findings and facts and make that connection and then convince the jury of it. So there are studies that show that it affects one's psychological development. Brain chemistry and hormonal levels are factors that are associated with and can lead to antisocial behaviors. Abnormal levels in one's neurotransmitters can influence or activate brain functions, and in turn can be associated with aggression. That's what the studies have found hormonal levels. Adolescents experience more intense mood swings, anxiety, and restlessness than adults. And that could explain high violence rates found among teen males, especially. We've already seen that they commit most of the violent crimes. There was a study done with testosterone. It has been linked to criminality and violence. Research has shown that exposure to unnaturally high levels of testosterone permanently alters behavior. Girls who were unintentionally exposed to elevated amounts of testosterone during their fetal development displayed a marked long-term tendency toward aggression. And on the other hand, with boys who were prenatally exposed to steroids that decrease testosterone levels, displayed a decrease in aggressiveness. So, certainly the biochemical makeup. Subarea 1, let's talk subarea 2. The neurological dysfunction. This is the second factor in the social theory that plays a role in one's choice to commit a delinquent act. The focus here is on the neurological brain and the nervous system structure of delinquents. The minimal brain dysfunction is what is referred to as damage to the brain itself that causes antisocial behavior injurious to the individual's lifestyle or social adjustment. This type of damage can lead to a reduction in executive functioning. And executive functioning skills, they help one get things done, right? These are the skills that are controlled by an area of the brain that's called the frontal lobe. And the executive function helps a person manage time, pay attention, switch focus, plan and organize, remember details, avoid saying or doing the wrong thing, doing things based on your experience, maybe multitasking. When executive function isn't working as it should, then behavior is less controlled. And this can affect one's ability to go to school or work or do things independently, maintain relationships. The impairment in executive function has been associated in a range of development disorders, including ADHD, conduct disorder, autism, and Tourette syndrome. The executive function impairment has also been associated with psychiatric and other medical disorders, such as schizophrenia on the extreme end, and diabetes and alcoholism and other brain diseases, the other spectrum of disorders, medical disorders. And how does it develop? Birth, inherited, brain injury. And brain injuries can occur at all time in a child's life. It could be the result of a severe beating, emotional trauma, abuse. The connection between crime and neurological impairment is interesting. 20% of known offenders report some type of TBI, traumatic brain injury, and suffer a number of antisocial traits and have done so throughout their life. And I have seen this time and time again amongst the young clients who I have represented when I learn about their background and their current situation. There is rarely, I can't even recall somebody who did not have some sort of disability in that sense. But I'd say it's mostly, there's something, in my experience, there's something else that's happening with an individual. Let's talk about ADHD, a condition that has been linked to antisocial behavior. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's a condition in which a child shows a developmentally inappropriate distractibility, impulsivity, hyperactivity, and a overall lack of attention. How does this behavior influence delinquency? There's a couple views. There's a direct view and an indirect view. The direct view is that hyperactive kids are delinquency prone. Another view, the indirect view, is that hyperactive kids don't do well in school, and educational failure is linked to delinquency. There was a series of research studies that's now linked to ADHD, to the onset and sustenance of a career criminal. Children with ADHD are more likely than non-ADHD youths to use illicit drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, be physically aggressive, and engage in sex offenses. And they're also more likely to be arrested, charged with a felony, or have multiple arrests. Learning disabilities is another neurological dysfunction. Arrested and incarcerated children have a far greater rate of learning disabilities than children in the general population. And there's two views on the link between learning disabilities and delinquency. The school failure rationale. The school failure rationale is the frustration that's caused by poor performance leads to a negative self-image and thus delinquent behavior by acting out. So that's one view of how learning disabilities ties in with delinquency. The susceptibility rationale is the other, which is the side effects of the disability, those side effects that come along with having learning disability, which is the impulsiveness or the inability to take social cues that causes delinquent activity. And learning disabilities has also been linked to substance abuse, which has been linked to delinquency. Also, a child with a learning disability is twice as likely to suffer from ADHD, and as discussed just moments ago, there is a link with delinquency and ADHD. So despite this, and we note that these links are controversial, the suggestion that the link could be, there is a suggestion that the link could be one of bias rather than one of a neurological dysfunction. Bias by the school or by the police, in that a child with learning disabilities is not any more prone to delinquent behavior than one with no learning disabilities. And that the suggestion is the child with learning disabilities faces an increase in being found delinquent by a court by the result of their school record. And the school record would outline learning disabilities and the problems. So the other side of the coin is that it's not related to any neurological dysfunction, but the delinquency is more linked to a bias. But there's always research to each piece of this puzzle. The arousal theory. According to the arousal theory, for a variety of reasons, people's brains function differently in response to their environment or this stimulus in the environment, stimuli in the environment. All of us seek to maintain a preferred or optimal level of arousal. Too much stimulation leaves us anxious and stressed, whereas too little makes us feel bored and weary. However, children vary in the way their brains process sensory input. Some always feel comfortable with little stimulation, whereas others require a high degree of environmental input to feel comfortable. And it's this later group of quote-unquote sensation seekers that looks for stimulating activities, which may include aggressive and sometimes violent behavior patterns. Although the factors that determine a person's level of arousal are not fully understood, suspected sources include brain chemistry, such as serotonin levels, and brain structure. Some people's brains have more nerve cells with receptor sites for the neurotransmitters. Another view is that adolescents with low heart rates are more likely to commit crime because they seek stimulation to increase their arousal to normal levels. A researcher Adrian Rain has found that antisocial children have lower resting heart rates than the general population. And in one study, he found that low heart rate may produce a need for stimulation that is associated with aggressive behavior patterns. It is also associated with impulsivity, which in turn is associated with lack of self-control and involvement in delinquent behaviors. So, ADHD, learning disabilities, arousal theories, the arousal theory, all fall under this sub-area of neurological dysfunction. We're going to turn to the last sub-area of biosocial theory, and that is the genetic influences. Studies suggest that there is a genetic component to crime, that is, crime is inherited to some extent, that the genetic makeup is passed down from parents to children, and that genetic abnormality is directly linked to a variety of antisocial behaviors. Researchers have tried to estimate the extent of genetic inheritance using several methods. Three predominant ones are the parental deviance, the twin behavior study, and the adoption study. The parental deviance, the study was conducted by David Farrington, suggests that there is a growing evidence that crime is intergenerational. In his Cambridge youth study, it indicates that a significant number of delinquent youths have criminal fathers. He found that one type of parental deviance, we'll use bullying, that's what he used, bullying, may be both inter and intra-generational, meaning that bullies have children who bully others, and those children grow up and father children who are also bullies. So David Farrington has tied in delinquent behavior to the parents' own deviant behavior. The twin studies is another area of research connecting delinquents and genetics. The twin studies compare identical twins and fraternal twins. Identical twins are genetically identical, while fraternal twins are about 50% genetically alike on those genes that vary among people. It is assumed that twins, whether identical or fraternal, are exposed to the same environmental factors. They live in the same household, they have the same parents. If a crime is genetically inherited, we would expect that identical twins would be more similar in criminal behavior than fraternal twins. And most studies indicate that that is the case. So twin studies, however, they do suffer from certain problems. Most notably, evidence suggests that identical twins are more likely to spend time together and share the same friends than fraternal twins. So these facts, they're peers, they're social peers. These facts, rather than their identical genes, may explain their greater similarity in criminal behavior. So there is that one issue relative to the identical twins. In the adoption studies, was another way to determine whether delinquency is an inherited trait by comparing the behavior of adopted children with that of their biological parents. The adoption studies also overcome some problems that are raised in the twin studies, but it doesn't mean they don't have their own issues. They're problem-free. The traits of adopted children, what happens in these studies is the traits of adopted children are compared to the traits of their biological parents. And if a tendency to commit a crime is inherited, there should be more crime among adopted children whose biological parents are criminals than among adopted children whose biological parents are not criminals. And most of the data does reflect that that is the case. One study showed that when neither adopted nor biological parents were criminals, 13.5% of adopted boys had criminal convictions. When adoptive parents were not criminals and the biological parents were criminals, 20% of the adopted boys had criminal convictions. So there was a connection relative to biological parents who gave their children up for adoption at an early age, like at birth. So there was no connection made initially between the adopted children, the children who were ultimately adopted. So, begs the question, is crime inherited? Those who support a gene-crime relationship maintain that antisocial behavior is roughly 50% heritable. And some calculate that the influence of genes on deviant behaviors may be as high as 85%. But researchers Burt and Simons believe, however, that the social environment plays a more critical role in shaping behavior than genes and hereditary, especially during the critical periods of childhood and adolescence. The environment, they argue, shapes biological processes and enables people to function and survive in existing social conditions. Human biological makeup helps people respond to the everyday situations and events they face in the social world. As environmental conditions change, so do the brain and nervous system. Adverse, dangerous, and negative environmentals or change in adolescents' brain functioning, causing them to respond to environmental events with aggression, violence, and coercion. So, when Burt and Simons called for an end to the gene-based research, they were met with a challenge from the other criminologists who found fault with their assumptions and who believe that a great deal of behavior, including delinquent behavior, is shaped by inheritance rather than by learned traits. So, needless to say, the debate over whether delinquent behavior is inherited remains to be seen, or remains open to be debated. And that concludes our discussion on the biosocial theory. We are going to move on to the psychological theories.